For over 50 years, the Mr. Min and Little Miss series have been beloved by multiple generations. With over 100 books, several spin off series, and countless pieces of merchandise, these colorful characters provided the world with endless entertainment. As of 2022, the series has been adapted for television 4 different times. Having grown up in the late 2000s, the most significant series to me has been the 2008-2009 series entitled The Mr. Min Show. For those of you unfamiliar with this show, The Mr. Min Show utilizes a very different format than most other television series. Instead of focusing each episode around a central plot, each episode is focused on a certain topic, which usually includes about 3 to 5 sketches in which how this plot somehow relates to that central topic. Also, rather than including every character in the Roger Hargreaves book series, the Mr. Min Show only included 31 characters as opposed to the 70 plus found in the original. Choosing such a small number allowed for the series to focus on developing the personalities of each character, rather than just getting a brief introduction to each. For this video, I'll be rating all 31 characters worst to best and creating an accompanying tier list. Before we get into the list, here's a little bit about my background with the Mr. Min. I was first exposed to the franchise in early elementary school through the book series. By the time the show was announced, I already owned the entire main canon book series and was very familiar with all of the characters. Before the television series came out, I made use of the Mr. Min Show official website, where I became familiar with the redesigns and voices chosen for the series. I watched the series as it airs and have rewatched it many times since. At some point during quarantine, I got bored and did a project where I tracked which Mr. Min appeared in each episode and which Mr. Min both appeared and had lines in each episode. Whenever I mention how prominently a character was featured in this series, I'm basing it off of these findings. Also, I found the second season to be superior to the first by a long shot, and I much prefer the US version to the UK one. Those are both entirely different discussions altogether, but I mentioned it so you would have more context as you viewed my list. Finally, I would like to point out that this list is in no way objective. My opinion is just as valid as anyone else's, and it's likely different from other viewers. You are more than welcome to disagree. However, I did my best to clearly lay out my reasoning for why I put each character in a particular spot. So without further ado, I will begin my list. My least favorite character on the show is Mr. Scatterbrain. Mr. Scatterbrain is the gender-bent version of the character Little Miss Scatterbrain from the book. However, when comparing the designs of the two, very few, if any, similarities exist, making Mr. Scatterbrain almost an entirely original character. On top of that, it's hard to tell how his design resembles the characteristic of Scatterbrain. The second issue I have with the character is the fact that most of his personality has little to do with him being scatterbrained. Yes, at times he is forgetful, but more often than not, his gimmicks just have to do with him being weird. What makes this issue so problematic is the fact that there are several Mr. Min characters from the book series that are designed to be weird. Mr. Nonsense could have easily been used and filled the exact same role much more effectively. The last issue I have with the character is the fact that he is extremely overused. In the first season, Mr. Scatterbrain was tied in the number 2 spot for most episodes with speaking appearances, meaning his presence really detracted from much more interesting characters. Additionally, many of these appearances relied on the same unfunny joke. Mr. Scatterbrain would be working at some sort of help desk would not understand what his customer wanted. Thankfully, his role was toned down in the second season, but the above issues still stand. All in all, Mr. Scatterbrain is a misnamed original character who overshadows several beloved classic characters from the source material. Since no character is completely bad, I will end this section on a positive note. I love Mr. Scatterbrain's voice and the quirky, nonsensical tone the vocal performance gives off. If he had just been replaced with Mr. Nonsense, he would have been significantly higher on the list. In the second worst spot, we've got another original character, Little Miss Calamity. Miss Calamity gets a lot of love in the fandom, but I struggle to see how she is anything more than a worse version of Mr. Bump. Like Mr. Scatterbrain, almost no aspect of her personality is reflected in her design. A fact made even worse when considering that calamity isn't even a word that is guaranteed to be recognized by the show's intended audience. Additionally, Miss Calamity is also very overused, taking the number 7 spot for most episodes with speaking appearances in the first season, the highest spot of all female characters. My big issue with that is the fact that Mr. Bump also ranks very high on this list and literally serves the exact same purpose in the series. Since the two characters appear very frequently and rarely ever together, the presence of both causes the first season to consist of a lot of simple slapstick and become monotonous very quickly. She ranks above Mr. Scatterbrain for 2 reasons. 1, at least her personality is consistent with her name, and 2, the writers decided to cut her from the series' second season, meaning she overall does significantly less damage. Her removal was the right decision because it allowed for the focus on characters from the book, and her niche in the series could continue to be filled by Mr. Bump. In the number 29 spot, we've got the first of the second season exclusive characters, Little Miss Curious. Those of you familiar with the show can probably very easily figure out why she ranks so low. Throughout the entire 52-episode season, Miss Curious is given 2 lines in a singular episode. Since curiosity is not a visual characteristic, it makes no sense for Miss Curious to be an almost entirely visual character. Additionally, the series already had Mr. Nosy, so there's really no reason to include another character who essentially fills the same role. Oh well, I guess I shouldn't let the gift horse in the mouth. The redesign and voice are pretty cute, so there's really no reason to complain that I got to see another book character, no matter how minimal. That being said, if I could trade Miss Curious for a different character from the original series, I would happily do so. For similar reasons to the character just discussed, Mr. Tall takes the 4th lowest spot. Like Miss Curious, Mr. Tall only speaks in 1 episode in the second season. However, in this case, the minimal speaking appearance works slightly better. Since height is a visual characteristic, it makes sense for Mr. Tall to be a mostly visual character. That being said, the execution isn't without flaw. Mr. Tall's 1 speaking appearance is in the 3rd to last episode of the series. What makes this a problem is the fact that throughout most of the second season, Mr. Tall's appearances just led to frustration at not knowing what he sounds like. Additionally, there are a few instances where it seems the writers were intentionally misleading us to believe that he would speak. When he finally does get a speaking appearance, we get to see a fun, deep voice and lots of personality. However, this honestly just left me wanting more. Okay, so we've gotten the 4 bad characters out of the way. Notice none of them are completely bad. They all had the potential to be good if some major adjustments had been made. From here on out, the rest of the characters are overall positive additions to the series, beginning with the number 27 spot, Little Miss Daredevil. With so many book characters, I'm not really sure why originals were included. That being said, Miss Daredevil doesn't do that much damage. Somewhat surprisingly, based on how often she's featured in merchandise, Miss Daredevil is actually one of the least prominently featured characters in the series. These infrequent appearances are generally pretty memorable, yet they don't overshadow anyone iconic. Additionally, there's not really any character from the original book series that could have filled the niche that Miss Daredevil fills. Plus, I do like the design and find it fitting this time around. All in all, Miss Daredevil is a good character who probably would have been a tier higher had she appeared in the book series. She's just not good enough of a character to place ahead of any of the classics. Also, although I still consider her a series original character, it is worth noting her similarities to Mr. Brave. Next up, we've got Mr. Bounce. Mr. Bounce is a character with a very specific gimmick, bounciness, making the character hard to utilize. His speaking appearances are relatively sparse, and he's primarily used for visual gags, an understandable decision for this character. Unfortunately, the speaking appearances are just infrequent enough that I struggle to understand his personality. Sometimes he'll come across as level-headed, while other times he comes across as quirky. Unlike Mr. Tall, however, it seems the writers at least attempted to give him enough speaking appearances for the viewers to become familiar with the character. Additionally, the vocal performance for this character is very charming, and his good qualities make Mr. Bounce worth including in the series. In the number 25 spot, we've got a character that underwent significant changes from her book series counterpart, Little Miss Whoops. In the book series, Miss Whoops was essentially a female Mr. Bump, while in the show she is more of a problem-causing klutz. This change is overall beneficial to the series. We definitely don't need a third Mr. Bump-esque character. Additionally, the redesign is cute and encapsulates her new personality. The same can be said for her monotone vocal performance, which really portrays her carelessness and obliviousness. The reason she ranks so low on the list is because she basically fills the same role in the series as another character, who we will discuss later. That character just does it slightly better. Next up, we've got another of the Season 2 exclusive characters, that being Miss Giggles. I know I've dwelled on some of the downsides of the second season characters, but I think overall adding new characters from the original series is a really good idea. It gave the season a little more spice and certainly enhanced the excitement of new episodes. Since the show had already established a formula in the first season, there was really no need for the new characters to play a super prominent role, explaining the decision to use these characters very sparsely. Miss Giggles has a total of 11 episodes with speaking appearances. Her minimal use was an understandable decision since, like Mr. Bounce, the character is defined by a very specific gimmick. Of these 11 episodes, 7 of them used the same joke. Miss Giggles is working as a receptionist and giggles at the caller's problems, yet somehow is still able to send for help. However, I'll give credit to the writers. This joke is pretty clever and funny. That being said, one consistently creative bit can't get her too high on the list, which is why she ultimately places so low. That being said, the adaptation is overall well done with a good design and cute voice. In the number 23 spot, we've got yet again another Season 2 exclusive character, Miss Balsy. At this point, you're probably noticing a trend with the new characters, and yes, Miss Balsy ranks so low because of the infrequency of her appearances. She only appears in 12 episodes in the entire series, tying her with Mr. Funny for the lowest number of appearances of all of the characters. Of these 12 episodes, she's given a speaking role in 7 of them. The reason she places above Miss Giggles? In those 7 episodes, Miss Balsy absolutely steals the show. First off, the vocal performance is incredible, going in an entirely different direction than any other series take on the character. Most previous adaptations give Miss Balsy a gruff, almost masculine voice. Here we see a high-pitched, sassy little miss who you clearly do not want to mess with. Secondly, the design has changed from the original version, ever so slightly, just enough to give her a younger, more feminine feel. Lastly, her role in the series really makes her stand out positively. She takes charge of whatever situation she finds herself in each sketch, while still giving other characters a chance to shine if need be. All in all, Miss Balsy is a very well-adapted character who deserved more appearances. Alright, so think of those last 5 characters as the second lowest tier on our tier list. All 5 of their inclusions in the show make the series better in some form or fashion. They just have significant flaws. The characters occupying the next tier all have minor flaws and are still overall positive additions to the series. I know that seeing such an iconic character so low on the list may raise some eyebrows, but unfortunately, Mr. Bump does not find himself any higher than the number 22 spot. Now, I will preface this by saying that Mr. Bump is a good character, and I have no serious complaints about the adaptation. The reason he ranks so low on the list is mostly because he's just not as interesting as the characters that rank higher. Unsurprisingly, Mr. Bump is the show's punching bag, and his main gimmick is slapstick comedy. Additionally, since he is such an iconic character, he is used a lot. While the Mr. Min Show is good at setting up funny slapstick bits, the series' real strength is witty dialogue formed through the interaction of different characters. Mr. Bump's ever-presence in the show means we get to see a lot less of this clever dialogue. Additionally, and this may just come down to personal preference, I'm not a huge fan of his voice. He's the only character for who I prefer in the UK voice. Nonetheless, most of the issues I have with Mr. Bump aren't with the character himself, just his overuse in the series, and for all intents and purposes, this is a good adaptation from the book. In the number 21 spot, we've got another character who has no serious issues, but unfortunately finds himself relatively low on the list. That character is Mr. Quiet. I definitely think they made the right decision in changing him from puke brown to a cool shade of blue. Mr. Quiet plays an important role in the series in the fact that he is often the eyes and ears of the audience, being able to notice things that other characters often can't. He usually serves as the most level-headed character in the sketch, which allows the quirkiness of characters like Mr. Grumpy and Mr. Fussy to shine through. Other than that, Mr. Quiet is just not a super interesting character, at least when compared to everyone else on the list. Side note, sometimes I can't really tell what he's saying due to his mumbling almost being inaudible. I guess I'll give him a pass though, since that's kind of the point of having a character called Mr. Quiet. Next up, we have got Mr. Nervous. Firstly, changing his name from Mr. Jelly was absolutely the right decision. Second, that his redesign works really well for this character, and it's definitely an improvement from the book version. Mr. Nervous fills a pretty unique role in the series and works really well as a victim character. He also very effectively complements several other characters, such as Mr. Quiet, Miss Scary, Miss Daredevil, Mr. Tickle, and more. His flaw? The daydreaming gag was overused and got old very quickly. Thankfully, this bit was dropped in the second season, making Mr. Nervous a great character. In the number 19 spot, we've got the most prominent of the Season 2 characters, Little Miss Magic. Like the rest of the new characters, Miss Magic has relatively few speaking appearances, but in this case they're frequent enough to come close to some of the minor Season 1 characters. As far as the character herself, this is a very clever adaptation. Design-wise, they were able to hold a lot from the source material while still making her fit her namesake characteristic. The voice is reminiscent of a Scottish wizard, a very clever choice. Her transition from an all-powerful entity to a quirky magician struggling to control her magic was charming and made the character all the more fun. Now, I will point out that 6 of her 13 speaking appearances rely on a similar joke to Mr. Scatterbrain customer service bit, but here it works immensely better in that it doesn't leave me frustrated with the character. All in all, Miss Magic is a strong character whose small number of speaking appearances cannot land her any higher on the list. In the number 18 spot, we have got the iconic Little Miss Sunshine. Too prominent of a book character not to use, the writers successfully adapted the cheerful Little Miss, whose positivity and optimism is welcome amongst a plethora of negative characters. Additionally, they are able to distinguish her enough from Mr. Happy that the two actually work really well together in a sort of complementary way. The issue I have with her is that her ditziness is occasionally overdone. At this point on the list, I have to get real nitpicky when talking negatively about the characters. However, I pointed it out because it does convey a negative message that optimistic girls are a little dumb. Nonetheless, Miss Sunshine is an extremely charming and lovable addition to the series, who I will happily accept, ditziness and all. In the number 17 spot, we've got another iconic character, that being Mr. Strong. Like Miss Sunshine, when being nitpicky, the one flaw I find with this character is that his stupidity is occasionally overdone, towing the line between dumb jock and questionable writing. Other than that, I love the direction the writers took with Mr. Strong. His voice seems to be an homage to Rocky Balboa, and being a bit of a movie nerd, I find this very clever. Mr. Strong is also a great example of a redesign. Since nothing about his appearance in the book series really conveyed Strong, the character underwent a total makeover, but still kept his red color as a reference to the original version. Mr. Strong works really well as a likable sort of gentle giant / handyman, and is utilized really well as a character, especially in the second season. Alright, so that completes our good with minor flaws tier. From here on out, every character is flawless, or at least is good enough that I'm willing to completely overlook those flaws, beginning with Mr. Small. Like a few characters mentioned previously, Mr. Small's defining feature is completely visual characteristic, making him somewhat hard to work with. However, here we have the first successful example of the writers adding personality traits unrelated to the character's name. Giving him a top hat and a dandy British accent, Mr. Small is transformed into a full-on delightful gentleman. And when given the opportunity to give him height-related visual gags, the writers take that opportunity, resulting in successful humor. It's hard to talk in depth about Mr. Small without also talking about Mr. Nosy, and don't worry, we'll get there soon. But in the meantime, know that Mr. Small is a charming addition to the show who doesn't really have any downsides. Next up, we have got Mr. Noisy. Although adding the megaphone is a very minor adjustment from the book version design, it still does a lot to hammer down the loud vibe that he gives. What makes this character really funny is his obliviousness to his own noise, and the resulting hypocrisy in telling others to be quiet. He also successfully fills the role of some sort of person in charge of announcements when the episode calls for it. Additionally, I love the vocal performance of this character and the nice little touch of having him loudly stomp every time he walks. There's not a lot to say about Mr. Noisy other than that he does his job and he does his job well. In the number 14 spot, we have got the least prominent of the Season 1 characters, Little Miss Naughty. The writers went in a very clever direction with this adaptation, giving Miss Naughty an enticing voice and an attractive blush. Additionally, they make clever use of her defining characteristic in that her pranks always backfire. This allows her naughtiness to be negatively portrayed in a way that doesn't seem preachy and is instead just funny. Like Mr. Noisy, she is not used much, but when she is used well. Miss Naughty is a very clever addition to the show, and there's really nothing bad to say about her. I alluded to him earlier, but here we have Mr. Nosy taking the number 13 spot. The redesign is certainly an improvement from the original, allowing him to still appear nosy without relying on the pun involving nose. The vocal performance is fun and gives him an innocently curious sort of vibe, which brings me to the main reason Mr. Nosy is such a great character. For someone whose defining trait is getting into other people's business, they somehow manage to not make the character creepy or stalker-esque in any way. Instead, Mr. Nosy just appears to be a happy-go-lucky, excitable Mr. Man who is always curious about those around him and is perfectly comfortable dropping in. One big aspect of his friendly nature comes from his friendship with Mr. Small. Although the decision to pair the two is odd and unintuitive, it works shockingly well. Not only does it help flesh out Mr. Small's personality, but it also transforms Mr. Nosy from a creepy loner to an affable drop-in character. Since seeing one means seeing the other, and since the two are able to bounce off one another really well, Mr. Nosy is not at all annoying to the viewer and is instead just humorous in the sense that he is an uninvited guest who comes with a friend. The viewer also earns more respect for Mr. Nosy since he is kind and helpful to Mr. Small. Since no one wants to watch a creepy, cringy character, Mr. Nosy's reinvention is certainly to his benefit. He He would honestly be a tier higher if it wasn't for the fact that a lot of his bits don't really have anything to do with him being nosy. Thankfully, this became less and less true as the series went on, making Mr. Nosy a character well deserving of a high ranking. Earlier, I said Miss Whoops was ranked low because another character fills the same niche, just does it better. Well, Little Miss Helpful is that character. While I don't really like the fact that the character's name contradicts her personality, she gets a pass since this aligns with her personality in the original series. For starters, the redesign is fantastic, keeping enough similarities from the book to make her recognizable, while tweaking just enough to encapsulate the wannabe handyman. I love the Southern Belle-esque voice, which hammers down her personality for reasons I don't really know how to describe. However, what really puts her so high on the list is her role in the series. It's funny to watch a character who makes so much effort to help others while somehow also making blatantly obvious mistakes. She's innocent, and the audience knows she is not malicious, yet she still causes trouble and helps to progress the plot. Miss Helpful is a well-adapted character with no significant downsides who effectively creates comedic situations and drives several plot lines. Next, we've got the last of the Season 2 exclusive characters, Mr. Funny. Yeah, I know what you're thinking. If I'm going to penalize characters such as Miss Balsy solely because they have few appearances, it's hypocritical to put the series' least prominent character, Mr. Funny, in the number 11 spot. But sure enough, I'm ready to defend placing him this high. For starters, because of the way they wrote the character, the infrequent appearance actually works. Every 5 or 6 episodes, we get a brief bit of physical comedy from Mr. Funny, just to shake things up a bit. If he'd appeared any more often than he did, the routine would likely have fallen into the same trap as the Mr. Nervous daydreams and gotten old very quickly. What truly makes Mr. Funny a great character is the genius behind the way that he was used in the series. Like I said before, the writers had sort of backed themselves into a corner regarding goofy characters thanks to the inclusion of Mr. Scatterbrain. However, they managed to adapt the iconic Mr. Funny through an extremely clever and creative solution. As an homage to classic comedians such as Charlie Chaplin and especially Harpo Marx, Mr. Funny no longer speaks and now only communicates through body language and honks of his horn. Even though he only interacts with other characters in 3 of his 6 appearances, Mr. Funny is a strong enough character to carry a scene on his own. Each scene, accompanied by a cheerful leitmotif whistled in the background, makes this unique character's appearance stick out amongst the rest of the bits. This is the proper way to do slapstick. Also, the redesign is fantastic, staying true to the books but doubling down on the clown-like attributes. I don't really have time to go into that, but hopefully you see why Mr. Funny is great. In the number 10 spot, we've got the character that underwent the most change from his book series counterpart, Mr. Lazy. I mean, look at the redesign compared to the original. Do you see any similarities? Nonetheless, the redesign screams lazy much more than the original weird body organ shape. Anyway, this character embodies laziness way more than the original version in terms of personality. In the book series, Mr. Lazy was essentially just Mr. Sleepy, in the sense that he spent most of his day asleep. Although the new version is prone to napping at random times and places throughout the day, what really defines this character is his avoidance of work in any form. This, along with his monotone voice, make for a hilarious character with plenty of witty one-liners. All in all, this hipster, trailer-living Mr. Lazy is much superior to the sleepy Mr. Lazy found in the original series. Sadly, his role was greatly reduced in the second season, only speaking in 8 episodes with a total of less than 20 lines. The utilization of Mr. Lazy is the only thing about the show's first season that I prefer over the second. If it wasn't for that, Mr. Lazy would be a tier higher on the list. Okay, that last tier was made up entirely of extremely strong characters. However, these next 9 are even greater, and the writers of the series deserve so much credit for bringing these characters to the television screen. Beginning with the main Mr. Man himself, Mr. Tickle. Remember how I said I was impressed with how the series managed to adapt Mr. Nosy, a character who's defined by wanting to pry into other people's affairs in a way that didn't seem creepy? Surely they couldn't pull that off with a character whose entire personality revolves around being determined to tickle everyone who he interacts with. Well, sure enough, they managed to do it. Let's dig into how. For those of you who don't know, Mr. Tickle was the very first Mr. Man ever created and has since become a mascot for the franchise. Because of this, he essentially had to be included in the series, giving the writers a bit of a challenge. Nonetheless, through a few clever tricks, they managed to make the serial tickler into a lovable character. For starters, he always asked for consent before tickling someone, a wise move on the writer's part for several reasons. Secondly, the voice really enhances the character, giving him an almost childlike quality. Seriously, imagine a character with Mr. Strong's voice asking if someone needed a tickle. Yeah, this is the only type of voice that would have worked for this character. What's more, it's not like Mr. Tickle is a character that is only occasionally used when the writers can make it work. Mr. Tickle is actually one of the more prominent characters in the series. They not only managed to make the character not bad, they managed to make him good. The series deserves massive props for the adaptation of Mr. Tickle, and he's only the number 9 spot. In the number 8 spot, we've got a character just about as iconic as Mr. Tickle, that being Mr. Happy. Unlike Mr. Tickle, however, Mr. Happy is actually a fairly easy character to adapt, just being defined by happiness. They could have taken the easy route, much like the book series, and just made him a happy guy who sort of serves as the eyes and ears of the audience. However, I much prefer the direction the show went with the character. Although occasionally Mr. Happy will serve as the relatable character in a skit, and he usually pulls it off, he's also shown to serve as a Stepford Smiler, or a character whose forced positivity is used to mask true frustration. He'll sugarcoat panicked advice when in a stressful situation, creating a humorous experience for the viewer. I also love the decision to make him a game show or talk show host, as the voice is perfectly suited for such endeavors. All in all, Mr. Happy is a wonderful character. For the number 7 spot, we're doing a complete 180 and talking about Mr. Grumpy. Mr. Grumpy is by far the most used character in the series, appearing in all but 2 episodes and speaking in 91 of them. Interestingly, like Mr. Happy, Mr. Grumpy's role is completely changed from the original series, being transformed from a temper tantrum-prone monster to the eyes and ears of the audience. Ironically enough, the role Mr. Happy usually played in the book series. That being said, the writers don't neglect to make him fit his name, constantly complaining and giving snarky remarks to the other characters. Even though the grumpiness is still apparent, the audience is able to relate to, or at least understand, the character. He essentially fills the trope found in almost all comedic series, the straight man or second banana. In other words, the character who maintains a straight face and demeanor amidst all the shenanigans caused by those around him. The show simply would not be the same without Mr. Grumpy. Once again, another fantastic redesign staying true to the books while toning down the angry aspect and highlighting the grumpiness. The character is an unexpected, yet perfect choice to fill an important role in the series. In the number 6 spot, we've got another fan favorite, that being Miss Chatterbox. Interestingly enough, in the book series, Little Miss Chatterbox is not super prominent. She mostly serves as the female counterpart to the Mr. Man of the same name. It wasn't until the television series came out that Miss Chatterbox became so popular, and I think the show is a large contributor to all the love that she gets. One reason Miss Chatterbox ranks so high on the list is the fact that she's a very versatile character. She can fill just about any role in any plot, as long as she is kept chatty. The series certainly takes advantage of this, and often uses her as a side character to observe and provide commentary on whatever main action is happening in the sketch. She's a very likable character, coming off as fun and friendly, though the chattiness is still very noticeable. Additionally, it was a very clever choice to give her a Valley Girl type voice, which does a lot to make the character so memorable. Overall, Miss Chatterbox is another example of the series elevating a character far above their book series counterpart. Alright, so continuing the streak of fan favorites, Mr. Messy takes the number 5 spot. First off, this is the right way to add non-eponymous characteristics to a character. The choice to have Mr. Messy serve as a 1970s style DJ somehow works really well. It's also an homage to the fact that Mr. Messy is voiced by Peter Michael, who wrote most of the music for the series. If any character gets points for the catchy songs we see throughout the series, it's gotta be Mr. Messy. Now, I could rave about the qualities of the show's music, but that's a little off topic for this video. Anyway, all this isn't to say that they neglect to make messiness a central part of the character's personality. Comically filthy and unhygienic, Mr. Messy is able to add a lot of absurd humor to the show. He comes off as a fun-loving Mr. Man who wins over some characters and causes frustration for others, all to a hilarious effect for us viewers. And I'm beginning to sound like a broken record here, but once again, I'm a huge fan of the redesign, certainly keeping him recognizable while changing just enough to further encapsulate his personality, and in this case, make it a little easier on the animators. Fantastic character who adds a whole lot to the show. In the number 4 spot, we've got the final Little Miss that will be discussed on this list, and that character is Little Miss Scary. Okay, so I raved about how they made Mr. Nosy and Mr. Tickle still fit their namesake personality without being creepy. I will now discuss how they managed to make a character called Miss Scary fit her name, yet not actually be scary to us viewers. The easy way out for a character like this would be to rely on nightmare fuel, but I can't find any instance of the series doing so. Instead, Miss Scary is a thrill-seeking prankster who finds herself at the center of all kinds of mayhem. An expert on monsters and a scary mask connoisseur, Miss Scary will often get other characters on some sort of wacky adventure just for the sake of her own amusement. Also, I'd like to point out that despite being written the way she is, she doesn't clash with Miss Daredevil or Miss Naughty at all and can actually pair really well with either of them. On top of all of this, I must commend her vocal performance and her vocal delivery. She provides a lot of dry wit to the series that you really can't get with any other character. Additionally, her thrill-seeking nature can border on absurdity, giving the viewer a chuckle. At the time of the series release, Miss Scary is a fairly new character, her book having only been published 5 years prior. But the decision to include her in the series was certainly the right one, as she ended up being one of the series' best executed characters. Alright, so those last 6 characters were phenomenal in every way possible, yet none of them made the top tier. Before I made the tier list, I was a little unsure how the whole thing would pan out, but I never questioned what characters would occupy the top 3 spots. These final 3 characters that we will be discussing in the video are truly something else, and I had to give them a tier of their own. These characters are the best of the best of the best, and hopefully I can present them in a way so that you can see why. We will begin this top tier by discussing Mr. Fussy. Now, some of you may have not expected to see Mr. Fussy ranked this high, but believe me, he deserves it. I think much of the fan base fails to realize how much Mr. Fussy carries the show's humor. Along with Mr. Grumpy, Mr. Fussy serves as the series' straight man. Fun fact, since the 2 characters essentially fill the same role in the series, they almost never interact, only 3 times throughout the whole show to be exact, despite being 2 of the most prominent characters. Anyway, one thing that sets Mr. Fussy apart is the delivery of his lines. He starts out each sketch with a very composed and polite manner, sugarcoating things to express his disapproval while still maintaining the appearance of being proper. Then, as other Mr. Men do more and more outlandish things, Mr. Fussy slowly loses his composed nature and almost always ends a sketch in a fit of rage. What makes this so funny is the fact that I find his reaction extremely relatable. It's human nature to want to be polite as long as possible, but some situations force us to drop this persona. Mr. Fussy perfectly encapsulates this tendency in all of us. And mind you, that's not to say he doesn't embody fussiness. He most certainly does his compulsion to keep all things neat. Additionally, this is one of the best designs in the series. They are able to take the book design, which barely resembles fussiness, and tweak it just enough so that Mr. Fussy very much resembles his namesake characteristic. So much so that I'm willing to completely overlook the questionable decision to rename him Mr. Persnickety in the first season. The proper British accent was also a great choice. All in all, Mr. Fussy is an all-around perfect character who's both crucial to the series while having additional good qualities on his own. When I think back on some of my favorite sketches in the series, the underlying commonality is that Mr. Fussy can be found in all of them. The reason he places lower than the top 2 characters is because he can't carry his own weight. It's his interaction with other characters that bring him up so high. The last 2 characters we will be discussing are able to carry the series on their own. Number 2 is a shocking pick and will require a lot of explaining. Despite all my prior criticisms of the series' original characters, Mr. Stubborn still managed to take the second highest spot. Like Mr. Scatterbrain, Mr. Stubborn is the gender-bent version of one of the book characters, that being Little Miss Stubborn. However, in this case I can actually see the resemblance in design. Additionally, there's really not another way they could have made the character work. There's no suitable male book series replacement, and I don't think I can see this character working without the same voice. Which brings me to the first reason Mr. Stubborn ranks so high on the list. This vocal performance is enough to make me chuckle every time he speaks. I don't know how Godfrey, the voice actor, was able to create a voice that encapsulates stubbornness with every sentence, but he manages to do so. I really can't even describe what about the voice it is, but hearing him make even a mundane greeting gives me the impression of a guy who is 100% set in his ways. Vocal performance alone would probably land him a top 10 spot on this list. However, the main reason he ranks so high is due to his personality. As expected with a character called Mr. Stubborn, his main gimmick is his unwavering refusal to change his mind, exhausting any and every logical fallacy to avoid admitting he was wrong. The gimmick is so simple, yet it always works. He pairs well with literally every single other character. It can also carry a scene on his own. If it wasn't for the fact he was a series' original character, he most likely would have taken the number 1 spot. However, I just couldn't justify putting him above the final character that we will be discussing. You probably figured this out by process of elimination if nothing else, but Mr. Rude is taking the number 1 spot. Essentially all of the good things I've said about other characters can be said about Mr. Rude, so I'll briefly go over all of them so you can see how. Firstly, we've got the design. Like many other characters discussed earlier, the redesign manages to keep a lot from the books, but just change enough to make the character's personality obvious. In the original series, Mr. Rude wore a top hat. I always found this choice a bit odd and never really understand what Hargreaves was going for in the illustrations. That is, until the series came out and took the same concept but executed it better. The top hat was supposed to be somewhat ironic in the fact that an angry looking character is wearing an unusually proper piece of clothing. The series went in the same direction but replaced the distracting top hat with slicked back hair and fancy shoes, which works much better for the character. Also, extra points for the couple of episodes where he wore a top hat just as an homage to the original design. Secondly, Mr. Rude's vocal performance and delivery is absolute perfection. I believe the French accent is a reference to the rude Frenchman in the film Monty Python and the Holy Grail, but it's the delivery that truly enhances the voice. Despite the thick accent, which by the way is not so thick that I can't understand him, the voice is able to convey a mix of annoyance, apathy, and anger, all necessary for the character's personality. I think just about all fans can agree that this is one of, if not the most memorable vocal performance in this series. Finally, I'll be talking about the direction that this series went with the character's personality, and oh, is it clever. No, I'm not just a sucker for fart jokes. I'm impressed with all the witty writing and dialogue. In the book series, Mr. Rude was tactless and would not hesitate to insult anyone about anything. In the show, he is that plus so much more. He's the guy who talks on the phone during a concert, the uninvited guest who complains about your food, the guy who wears a large hat at the movie theater blocking your view. We all know him, we all hate him. That being said, occasionally he will play the role of a straight man, and it still works. In terms of adaptation, design, voice, versatility, and humor, Mr. Rude encapsulates everything that makes the Mr. Men Show such a phenomenal series. So there you have it, my ranking of all 31 characters in the series. I think the series did a great job of selecting a cast of characters that made the show feel full. There are a few more characters that I would have liked to see adapted. I think Mr. Greedy and Mr. Clever could have been useful, and I also think they could have worked with Mr. Sneeze, Mr. Topsy-Turvy, Mr. Slow, or Mr. Cool. But all in all, I think the series did really well at selecting which characters to include. Essentially, every character fills a different niche. We definitely didn't need Mr. Mischief when we already had Miss Naughty, Mr. Silly when we already had a Mr. Funny, Mr. Impossible when we already had a Miss Magic, etc. I can think of plenty of more examples. To close out this video, if anyone's actually made it this far, I'd like to invite discussion in the comments section. Do you have any disagreements with my list? Is there anything I'm not considering? Anyway, thank you for watching this video. It was a lot of fun talking about all my thoughts, and I hope that you enjoyed the viewing experience.